This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode. What feature does a wildlife supporting landscaper refuse to install in a garden? What's the most beneficial addition for wildlife? And how can hard landscaping be compatible with wildlife and nature? This week, my guest is former ecologist and founder of NatureScaping, Nick Townsend, who sheds light on building greener gardens. Nick uses his knowledge of ecology and the environment in his landscaping business in order to make better gardens and outdoor spaces for wildlife.
I've graduated university in 2017 from Aberystwyth. I ended up getting a master's in environmental management. And with that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, to be honest. It's the classic story of going to uni, getting a degree and just sort of coming out of it and moving back in with the parents. They call us the boomerang generation. But with that, eventually, I got an internship to become an ecologist, which I was pretty passionate about at the time. You know, I really liked the idea of doing newt surveys and bat surveys and helping out wildlife that way. But it was quite a lot of office work. And yeah, I didn't particularly gel that well with sitting in the office quite a lot. And then COVID came around and I lost that ecology job because of COVID. So I was in the situation where I was living with my parents. I was jobless. Sounds a bit depressing when I say it out loud, but I was in that situation. So I kind of thought, well, now's my chance to decide what I really want to do in my life. And I knew that I wanted to work outside and ideally with some kind of nature in mind. It was as vague as that. So I ended up doing a bit of volunteering in the Peak District at the Roaches. So working with this group of guys every Friday, doing like pathway maintenance and a bit of dry stone walling, stuff to boost the CV to get a job that would be outside and ideally working with nature. And I did 2 whole days with them and herniated a disc in my spine. So it didn't start very well. And that herniated disc meant that I was off work for like 4 months. So it's kind of ironic, really. The thing that I was doing to increase my CV made me not able to work for a number of months. So that's when it got really depressing, living with my parents in physical pain and just not working because I couldn't really stand up. And during that period of, back pain, just by chance, an old friend got in touch with me and she knew that I used to be an ecologist and she wanted a bit of advice on how to increase biodiversity in a garden that she was planning. So she basically asked me to come up with a garden design that incorporated a load of wildlife friendly features. So I thought, yeah, why not? I've literally got nothing else better to do, just lying down all day. So I did a load of research and looked up how to basically landscape. So started off simple, watching YouTube videos on the basics of landscaping, how to lay patios and stuff, as well as a piece of software called SketchUp, which is a 3D modeling software, which I used to come up with this garden design for my friend. So it took me a few weeks, but I produced this document with a garden design that had a load of features in that would increase wildlife, and I sent it over to her. And I think she was pretty happy with it. It was quite a large document in the end. I think I went a bit overboard, but for your first one, you never really know what to do. But yeah, she's pretty pleased with it. And she decided to go ahead with the project. And at that point, I thought, yeah, why not? I mean, I've done all this research. I've looked into how to become a landscaper and how to increase biodiversity in like a garden setting. So why not try my hand at a little bit of landscaping? So I got in touch with the Prince's Trust. And for those of you who don't know, Prince's Trust is a charity that helps young people set up businesses. So they provide a free business mentor and help with accountancy and help with marketing and stuff like that. So I spoke to the Prince's Trust, got a business mentor, and we started discussing basically how to set up a landscaping business with very little experience. And from that, I decided to start the business with the niche in mind of landscaping with wildlife in mind, and landscaping with the aims of increasing biodiversity in domestic settings, in garden settings. So it basically came from that, really. Yeah, I ended up buying a really bad van and getting a few basic tools. And I got in touch with an old school friend who was a self-employed handyman at the time. And I asked him if he wanted to come and join and do a few gardens with me, see how it went. Yeah, we just started off small. First of all, got a little patio job and just sort of built it up from there, really. It appears that a lot of people appreciate the niche of landscaping with both people and wildlife in mind. So that's how it came to be, really.
Fantastic. What a story. And out of a not very good situation came a kind of drive to do something really positive. You really did take the ball by the horns and just got on with it. And that is brilliant. So you've got a company at the moment, which is NatureScaping. And you said actually people are interested in the way you work. Who are your typical clients? Are they people that come to you specifically because of what you do, or are they people that come and then you win them over with your approach?
Yeah, it seems like most people are interested in helping out wildlife. I think most people have a general awareness of what's going on in the world with climate change and habitat loss and things. I'd say there's probably a 50-50 split between our clients of people who actively seek us out and want an aspect of their garden either rewilding or like a wildlife friendly feature putting in. And the other 50% of people are just interested in basic landscaping, so getting a patio or a pergola or a bit of fencing. But whenever I speak to clients, oftentimes we suggest things to clients that are wildlife friendly that they may not necessarily have thought of. Because if you're not in this industry and you haven't done a bit of research, you might not necessarily be aware that, for example, you can get like a wildflower meadow in turf form, or you can get things like bog gardens, niche stuff like that that you wouldn't necessarily think of if you weren't a landscaper. So we do suggest these different features to people. Try not to be too pushy because nobody likes being lectured about stuff. But yeah, it seems like most people do have a general interest in helping out local wildlife for sure.
That's very heartening to hear, I have to say. And if the person wasn't the right fit for you, I presume you would just say, okay, well, we're not going to maybe be able to work in the way that we want to. So are there times when you might just say, okay, well, we may not be the landscaper for you?
Yeah, it has happened on occasion. It's a bit more rare than you'd think. Maybe because the marketing for the business is aimed at sort of wildlife friendly landscaping. Maybe people who really aren't interested in it wouldn't even get in contact in the first place. But there's a couple of jobs that we have had to turn down or at least alter in a pretty major way. And they mainly revolve around AstroTurf, to be honest with you. Yeah, I flat out refuse to put in any fake grass. It's one of my passions, how much I dislike it. So it's mainly that nature of job, really. But most people are willing to be flexible. I think if you have just an honest, calm conversation with someone about the impacts of different features that they may want, then oftentimes they're willing to switch up the design a little bit.
That was going to be one of my questions actually about the fake grass. But I was thinking as well, I looked on your website and you've obviously got examples of your projects. And there are times when people want and need hard landscaping in a garden. It's just a feature of life and, it makes the garden usable in a lot of instances. So is hard landscaping ever compatible with nature and wildlife? Or do you sort of take the hit if you want to put that, say, around the house? Do you then maybe say to the client, let's offset the impact of that by putting a wildlife friendly feature in another part of the garden?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's kind of case by case specific because in a lot of projects we're replacing one patio, for example, with a new, better patio. We never destroy really nice habitat to put in a patio or some decking or whatever. A lot of times, our general projects is that we'd go into a garden that's basically featureless. We have a lot of work with new build gardens, so I'm sure you can imagine it's literally just like a square of grass. And I think there can be a balance between hard landscaping and wildlife friendly landscaping. We certainly try and strike the balance anyway. Yeah, I think most projects that we get involve hard landscaping in some form or another. It's quite rare that clients will get in touch and sacrifice hard landscaping in order to get a purely wildlife friendly feature. Most of the time, it's balanced out between patios, for example, and a nice pond as well, or some borders and a bit of decking. Most of the time, it's, yeah, a bit of both. And it's important to remember that gardens are very much for people as well as wildlife. As much as I like to think we're doing this just for wildlife, it's the clients that pay us. So we've got to listen to them. But yeah, I think if people have a better sense of connectivity with nature, I suppose, and if they have access to nature, then it gives them a better sense of stewardship or being interested in their local wildlife. And if that means putting in a patio in someone's garden and getting rid of a little bit of lawn, for example, if it means that they feel more connected and happy with their outside space, then I think oftentimes it's worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, if you can get someone out into their garden and interacting with the other bits of it that may be more wild or observing it, then I think that is the key. It's very easy for someone to have a garden that they look out the window at and go, oh God, I don't even know where to start with that, or it's a mess, or I don't want to go out there because the weather's bad and the grass is muddy. So yeah, I think that's a really, really important thing. And also thinking about the way you work. I mean, for me, if I go into a garden, I'm very nervous, I suppose, to disrupt the things that are in there, which is not such an issue, obviously, as you said, if you're working with new builds. But if you go to a garden and there might be things that you don't want to disturb, or there might be bits of the job that you do that you know might have a sort of shorter term impact on habitat or wildlife, are there any good workarounds that you've found that protect and encourage wildlife even though you're going in and making changes in a space?
Yeah, for sure. If there's any major feature in the garden that we identify as really good habitat, for example, like a big old mature tree, we'll always try and persuade the client to keep that feature in. And if we have to change the design or change the way we work or change the sort of process of work, then we'll do it. Landscaping, it can be quite a destructive trade, really. And even though we are creating habitat in a lot of jobs, there are a few issues with landscaping or the construction industry in general. So one thing that's hit me over this past 3 years of landscaping is that there's an awful lot of plastic waste in this industry. So we'll get a pack of slabs and they'll be wrapped in unrecyclable plastic and with plastic straps on them. And that sort of stuff will just end up in the skip. And like a bulk bag that people see in projects, a big bulk bag of aggregates, that's basically like the size of a duvet made out of plastic. And they're pretty hard to recycle. There's a few recycling plants dotted around the UK, but generally for most projects, all this plastic will end up in the skip as well. And it's not just plastics, there's material waste. So there's some estimates that says 30% of materials used in a construction job, like a landscaping job, end up as waste, whether that's like excavation materials or leftover materials or cut-offs. So there's a lot of wastage and also a lot of CO2 produced as well. It sounds pretty bad, but the way I look at it, if we're able to cut down a little bit on these plastic waste items, so for example, using materials that are already on site or using reclaimed materials instead of brand new materials, and at the same time, we're able to create habitat that wasn't there before and significant habitat as well, then do the ends justify the means? Is it worth all this destruction, unavoidable destruction, I suppose? I think if the end result is a positive net gain in biodiversity, then I think so, yeah. But to go back to the original question, it's definitely not without its issues, not without its destruction or waste materials. But I think as long as we're getting a biodiversity net gain in most jobs, hopefully it's worth it.
And you mentioned obviously the artificial turf. Is there anything apart from that that you won't build or install, or you're just really not in favour of?
I think artificial turf is probably the main one, to be honest. There's some things that we won't do. For example, a client contacted me a couple of years ago asking if we could fill in a wildlife pond, a mature wildlife pond, in order to replace it with a patio. And I had to turn that job down because I went to go and look at the pond and it was like full of lilies and plants and things. And there's probably amphibians in there. There's definitely invertebrates. And I just couldn't bring myself to take that job on, just completely destroying habitat for no net gain of biodiversity. So apart from that, I think it's just the astroturf that's the main thing that we won't do.
I've heard a lot of people actually get asked to fill in ponds. I think it's not that uncommon, sadly, and it is a tricky thing to do, definitely. But sort of spinning it on a positive, obviously, you mentioned putting in wildlife ponds. That's a brilliant thing, I'm sure, for gardens and for wildlife. Are there any other features that you like installing because of their benefit to wildlife?
Yeah, I think I mentioned earlier about the wildflower turf. That's really good because wildflowers, well, they're a fantastic habitat and source of food for loads of different pollinators and invertebrates and things. But they can be pretty tricky to grow from seed. You need the right type of soil, you need to sow them at the right time, and they do require a fair bit of maintenance. So whenever I suggest we get a patch of wildflowers, or if clients ever request wildflowers, I'll always suggest wildflower turf. And there's loads of different types of wildflower turf you can get with loads of different types of flowers that flower at different times of year and grow to different heights. So I think aside from putting in self-sustaining wildlife ponds, I think wildflower turf is probably our next go-to boost for biodiversity.
And I think there might be a perception, and it might be right or it might be, not quite correct, but sometimes wildlife gardens are seen as potentially more difficult to maintain. Do you have to work towards explaining to a client how the garden will evolve, or do you just at that point, once you've finished your job, do you then hand it over to wonderful maintenance people and let them deal with it?
Whenever we put in a feature like a pond or a bit of wildflowers or just a border, then I will explain that, well, everything needs a little bit of maintenance. But you're right, there is a bit of a misconception that these wildlife gardens are more high maintenance than your traditional low maintenance gardens. The ponds that we create, we use low nutrient clay soil that we plant plants directly into. And with that, it creates like a self-perpetuating ecosystem that doesn't need oxygenating with pumps. It doesn't need any feed or doesn't need weeding after a couple of years, at least anyway. So yeah, I think it is a misconception that wildlife friendly features can be high maintenance. And the same with wildflowers as well. They only need cutting once or twice a year, depending on what sort of aesthetic you want. And whenever I tell clients this, they're usually pretty surprised, which is quite nice to hear because it sort of makes it easier to persuade people to get these sorts of features if they know that it's not going to be really high maintenance. If anything, the more wild the garden, the less maintenance you've got to do because you're always going to get weeds and things. So why not just call them wildflowers instead of weeds?
Exactly. So it's interesting that you mentioned about the planting into low nutrient soil. I was going to ask you, are there any sort of newer techniques that you're trialing or that you've seen and want to try? And I was thinking about things like using waste materials to plant into, or sand or recycled aggregates. Is there anything like that you're exploring?
Yeah, whenever we need low nutrient soil, we normally import it because then we're guaranteed it to be low nutrient. Unless we've dug up a load of subsoil from site, it is clearly really low nutrient. In terms of new techniques, I think we're always pushing to reduce our carbon footprint more so than experimenting with new sort of planting techniques. So we do this by, as I mentioned, using a lot of reclaimed materials. So, for example, on the job that I'm working on now, we're doing this big area of decking, and we could have easily suggested to the client, stick a load of composite decking down. It's really low maintenance and it will last for thousands of years, sort of thing. But instead, we had a chat with the client and we agreed that we're going to use reclaimed scaffolding boards that are locally sourced. So not only have we cut down on the plastics, but it's associated carbon emission, and we're using locally sourced stuff, which is always better. And it's again like using stuff on site as well. So if we're taking down an old brick wall, for example, to put in a patio, we can actually use those bricks to crush up and use as a sub base for the patio. So it's kind of thinking a little bit outside the box when it comes to the process of landscaping. Yeah, that helps alleviate some of these negative aspects, I suppose.
Do you find that ends up saving the client money, or can it cost them more sometimes because you've got to process the materials or on site, or is it kind of swings and roundabouts?
I think most times it actually saves the client money, because I suppose our main way of recycling materials is chipping things up and using it as sub base for a patio or driveway or whatever. I'd say that normally saves the client money, because not only do we not have to buy a load of aggregates, we don't have to buy or rent a skip as well. So most of the time it's saving money. Sometimes it might cost a little bit more. It just depends on the materials, I guess. Yeah.
It's a very admirable thing to do that if you can. And I'm sure people will do more of it as materials become more expensive and the cost of, like you say, skips and things gets more expensive. Thinking about the wider picture, do you think things in the industry are changing? Are you confident with the way things are progressing?
Potentially, yeah. I'm still relatively new in the industry. It's been just over 3 years since I've started. So I can't say what it was like 10 years ago. But there seems to be a growing awareness, definitely. And there are a few promising new innovations, like no dig subbases, which is like a grid system that you put around tree roots that you can then build on top of. So instead of digging down into tree roots and putting down a load of subbase, it's basically a way of protecting tree roots. I think that probably has quite a lot to do with different legislation that comes out. I think there's another cement alternative that they're working on at the minute that's pretty brand new. So yeah, I'd like to think that because of the general public's awareness or government awareness of the impact that the construction industry is having around carbon emissions and waste, that hopefully biodiversity beneficial inventions and innovations are going to come out in the future.
I think a focus for the podcast lately has been thinking about how people work, especially if they're in the industry. And sometimes you can be lone working, or you can feel you're not necessarily part of a bigger network as you would be if you worked for a larger company, for example. Are there things that could be useful to you in terms of supporting your business, or what would you need to make your life easier and help the way that you want to work?
Yeah, there's definitely resources out there. It can be a bit of a isolated trade, I suppose, because it's just my team and I going to different clients, and that's it. If you're not careful, you'd never have access to other contractors and their way of working with it. In the future, we are going to look to expand, and with that will come a membership to a couple of different landscaping bodies that basically fosters a community of loads of different landscapers around the UK. From that, you could bounce ideas off each other and get a better sense of which way the industry is heading in.
Thank you very much to Nick for sharing his work and providing hope that there are people out there striving to build greener gardens. Thanks to you as well for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 302 with Dave Warmer of Greenheart Horticulture and episode 273, Landscape Led with Alexandra Steed. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.